March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea. On the bridge of his flagship, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura lights a cigarette and watches the horizon sharpen against the pale light. 8 destroyers escort 8 transports, their wakes slicing perfect scars across the calm water. Below deck, 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division wait, rifles oiled, uniforms pressed, hearts convinced. They've been promised safe arrival at Lae. Kimura believes that promise. For 12 months, Japanese convoys have crossed these waters untouched. American bombers had tried and failed to hit moving ships. Torpedo planes required long, predictable runs. High-altitude attacks wasted fuel and missed everything. Experience became confidence. Confidence became doctrine. And doctrine, by 1943, had hardened into faith. The Japanese Navy trusted geometry. Each convoy moved like a living diagram. Destroyers tracing circles of protection, gunners drilling at identical angles, commanders trusting in what they called the umbrella of steel. It was a system that had worked until the enemy changed the system itself. Across the sea, in the humid workshops of Brisbane, Australia, another kind of weapon was being born. Not from generals or blueprints, but from grease, improvisation, and defiance. Mechanics tore apart B-25 Mitchell bombers, replacing bomb bays with belts of ammunition, fusing human instinct with industrial brutality. 8. 50 caliber machine guns now jutted from each nose like metallic fangs, the birth of the Strafer gunship. These were not aircraft meant for precision. They were built for saturation, for drowning the enemy in a storm of steel and fire. And their creators understood something that no doctrine could quantify. That in modern war, innovation moves faster than hierarchy, and improvisation can outpace tradition. At this hour, Kimura knows none of it. His formation holds perfect symmetry. Signal flags ripple in the wind like theatre curtains. The sea belongs to the Empire, or so every man aboard believes. But belief has limits, and beyond the horizon, engines are already turning the sound of mechanical prophecy. In 4 hours, those engines will descend upon this convoy at wave-top height, spitting 6,800 rounds per minute, an unbroken chain of metal linking workshop to warfare, imagination to extinction. They will not come as bombers. They will come as machines of conversion, turning human pride into industrial debris. Kimura exhales smoke and studies the horizon, unaware that the glow on the water is not dawn, it is reflection. Reflection of the very logic that will undo him. The belief that courage can substitute for systems, that discipline can replace design. In a few hours, his fleet will not just be destroyed. It will be outdated. The clock ticks. The sea holds its breath. And far beyond the reach of binoculars, in a hangar soaked with sweat and oil, the new war begins to hum. A war not fought by men, but by ideas made metal. The Japanese think they are sailing into battle. They are sailing into the future. To understand Admiral Kimura's certainty, one must understand the logic of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force built on discipline, pattern, and past success. From 1941 to early 1943, Japan's war machine moved with mechanical precision. Its officers had grown up on victories that reinforced an unshakable belief that mastery of form equaled mastery of war. The Empire's fleets had swept through the Pacific and Southeast Asia, crushing Allied resistance at Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, and the Philippines. The formula seemed simple: speed, coordination, and the spirit of the warrior, Yamato Damashi. But beneath the spiritual language was a technical structure, doctrine that treated war as geometry. Japanese naval strategists viewed the ocean as a set of predictable variables. The ideal fleet was a synchronized instrument, one that could absorb attacks through maneuver and concentrated fire, rather than absorb change through innovation. Their air defense tactics reflected this precision thinking. Destroyers forming concentric rings, anti-aircraft guns aligned to intersect at calculated altitudes, every sailor drilled to act without hesitation. By 1943, that precision had hardened into a theology of control. The umbrella of steel was more than metaphor. It was engineering faith. Each convoy carried over 120 anti-aircraft guns, including the standard 25mm Type 96 autocannon, backed by heavier 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Their overlapping fields of fire were designed to shred attacking aircraft long before bombs could fall. The system had worked before against high-altitude bombers that rarely struck a moving target, against torpedo planes whose attack runs could be timed and evaded. It created a pattern of survival that looked like proof. Commanders like Captain Tamichihara of the destroyer Shigure and Commander Yasumi Doi aboard Tokitsukaze trusted these procedures as if they were physics. They believed the fleet could not be surprised, because surprise did not fit into the diagram. To them, American air power was clumsy, inefficient, and predictable. Their perception came from data, but the wrong data. They measured bombs missed, not systems changing. They saw failure in American accuracy, not evolution in American thinking. This misunderstanding was amplified by doctrine itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw aerial warfare as an extension of surface warfare, a contest of vectors and timing, where disciplined fire could outmatch improvisation. It was a world where human will, not mechanical adaptability, determined victory. So, when intelligence officers reported that the Americans were modifying medium bombers in Australia, the information was dismissed as irrelevant. No aircraft could combine speed, precision, and firepower. No workshop could replace a navy. Yet in the same moment, across the Pacific, Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned improviser, was doing exactly that, transforming B-25 Mitchells into low-altitude gun platforms. Where Japan saw war as form, America was beginning to see it as function. Still, inside Kimura's formation that morning, confidence reigned absolute. His captains calculated ammunition expenditures to the round. His lookouts measured altitudes by reflex. His destroyers, Asashio, Arashio, and Shirayuki, formed a triangle of steel around the transport's geometry incarnate. In that formation, logic and faith became the same thing. For the men on deck, belief in the system was belief in civilization itself, in the perfection of Japanese order against the chaos of Western improvisation. Even as the convoy steamed into range of Allied aircraft, the officers' calm reflected something deeper than arrogance. It was industrial certainty. A system that had worked yesterday was assumed to work tomorrow. But war, by 1943, had stopped rewarding tradition. It was rewarding adaptation. In the coming hours, the Japanese Navy would confront an idea it had never modeled, that a workshop could outthink a fleet, that an experiment could outweigh experience. The Empire had built its naval doctrine on discipline. America was about to prove that disorder, when industrialized, could be far deadlier. The logic of confidence was perfect. But like every perfect machine, it had one flaw. It could not evolve while it was working. What Admiral Kimura could not see, what no Japanese officer could imagine, was that somewhere far south, a different kind of army had already replaced doctrine with design. At Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, the noise of hammers and drills never stopped. There, amid oil drums and scavenged metal, Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a restless former Navy pilot turned engineer, was dismantling the boundaries of aviation logic. He understood something no manual had written, that precision is meaningless if you can't hit anything. High-altitude bombing had failed. Torpedo attacks required skill and equipment the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't possess. So Gunn built his own solution with his hands, not his rank. Working alongside Jack Fox, a North American aviation field representative, Gunn stripped the B-25 Mitchell bomber to its bones. He tore out the bombardier's compartment. He welded reinforcement plates into the nose. Then, with the blunt practicality of a mechanic, he mounted 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns forward, transforming a medium bomber into something feral. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute, spitting armor-piercing incendiary shells at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Together, they unleashed 6,800 rounds per minute, a torrent of metal that could shred a ship's bridge before the crew could even turn their guns. What began as frustration became invention. What began as improvisation became industry. And when Gunn's aircraft lifted off for its first test run, the airfield crews watched in disbelief. The nose of the B-25 glowed with fire, a machine literally breathing bullets. The recoil shook the aircraft like a living creature, but it held together. The experiment had worked. That moment, obscure, unrecorded in official communiques, marked the true beginning of the industrial counterattack. For the Americans, victory would no longer depend on precision or heroism. It would depend on throughput, on how many bullets, how much metal, how fast it could be delivered. The new doctrine was not written in headquarters. It was written in the tempo of assembly lines. American mechanics could alter a bomber faster than Japan could rewrite its manuals. And that speed of adaptation, the velocity of innovation, became the real weapon. When Gunn combined the 8-gun nose with a new low-altitude bombing technique called skip bombing, the system achieved something terrifyingly efficient. By dropping bombs from only 200 feet above the water, pilots could make them skip across the surface like stones, striking ships at the waterline before detonating. The combination of strafing and skipping transformed the ocean into a firing range. The Australians helped refine it. At Port Moresby, pilots practiced on the wreck of the SS Pruth, learning to time their runs to the second, memorizing altitudes, speeds, and distances until their attack profiles became muscle memory. It was mechanical discipline, the kind that belonged not to warriors, but to engineers. By early 1943, General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, understood what he possessed. He called them commerce destroyers, machines built not to duel with enemies, but to erase their supply lines. To the Japanese, the idea was inconceivable that a bomber could fight like a fighter, that a workshop could outthink a naval academy, yet that was precisely what was about to happen. The Americans had discovered the invisible dimension of warfare, not just the weapon, but the system behind the weapon. Every B-25 Strafer was more than a plane. It was an industrial message, proof that in the modern age, innovation did not come from heroism, but from process. And when those engines started that morning over Australia, each propeller blade was already turning inside a larger machine, one made of factories, logistics, and a nation's capacity to learn faster than its enemies could die. The Japanese believed war was an art. The Americans were turning it into manufacturing. The system was unseen, but it was already in motion. And within hours, it would arrive over the Bismarck Sea, carrying with it the sound of a new era, the roar of industry weaponized into rhythm. 600 hours became 1,000 hours. Between those 2 points in time, history rewired itself. The Japanese convoy moved east through the Bismarck Sea, 8 destroyers encircling 8 transports, geometry in motion. The water glimmered with the calm arrogance of doctrine. Lookouts scanned the horizon for the familiar sight of high-flying bombers, confident they could handle anything that came from above. What they didn't see was the future coming from below. At 7,000 feet, the first formation of American bombers appeared. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells, approaching at medium altitude. The Japanese recognized the pattern instantly, a standard high-level attack, easy to counter. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons skyward. Rangefinders locked. A storm of tracers filled the air, arching upward in perfect rhythm. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. While every Japanese eye watched the heavens, the real assault arrived just above the water. 13 Australian Beaufighters and 12 B-25 Strafers, flying so low their propeller wash cut streaks across the sea. Leading the attack was Major Edward "Ed" Larner, commanding the 90th Bombardment Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group. His B-25, nicknamed Ruthless, skimmed the surface at 280 miles per hour, the ocean rising and falling beneath it like a pulse. Ahead of him, the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki loomed, its deck alive with movement. For a split second, the world stood still, 2 industrial philosophies facing each other across a few hundred yards of water. Larner pressed the trigger. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupted in unison, each firing 850 rounds per minute. Tracers lanced forward, forming unbroken lines of light between sky and sea. Within seconds, 900 armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through Shirayuki's bridge and superstructure. The glass exploded inward, steel bulkheads shredded, and entire gun crews vanished in flashes of white fire. A Japanese ensign named Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors, later described it as being caught inside a machine cutting metal. He was not wrong. The B-25 was a flying factory, a system designed to turn motion into mass production. Each burst of gunfire was a manufacturing process completed in milliseconds. Each aircraft was a conveyor line of death. When Lana's bombs struck, they did not fall. They skipped. Two 500-pound bombs bounced across the surface like skipping stones, slamming into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline, before detonating 5 seconds later. The explosion cracked Shirayuki's spine. The destroyer listed hard to port, flooding rapidly. Behind Lana, 11 more B-25 seconds began their runs, each pilot choosing a target with mechanical precision. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, flying the Hell's Fire, strafed the transport Kyokusei Maru from bow to stern, walking his tracers methodically across its decks before dropping 2 bombs that ripped open its cargo holds. The bridge crew never saw him, because they were already dead. Australian Beaufighters dived next, their 20mm cannons and 303 caliber guns focusing on anti-aircraft emplacements, silencing any return fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, flying at mast height, described seeing men lifted into the air by explosions as his rounds shattered lifeboats and bridge structures. Each moment of chaos was engineered. Every plane had its altitude, its timing, its lane of attack like moving parts in a single invisible machine. Within minutes, the convoy's formation disintegrated. The destroyer Arashio, attempting to shield the transports, became a magnet for concentrated fire. 3 B-25 seconds converged on her simultaneously, pouring more than 2,000 rounds per minute into her superstructure. The ship's bridge dissolved under the impact. Steering jammed, Arashio veered uncontrollably and collided with the transport Nojima. The 2 ships locked together, burning as one metallic carcass. Admiral Kimura, still aboard his flagship, could see the scale of destruction, but not its meaning. The Americans weren't attacking ships. They were attacking systems. Every 10 seconds of combat translated into a new layer of failure. Gunnery coordination collapsed when command bridges were vaporized. Communications vanished as aerial masts were shredded. Doctrine broke down when the air no longer obeyed its geometry. In 15 minutes, an entire military logic unraveled. For the Japanese sailors in the water, survival became meaningless. Many watched as B-25 seconds turned back to strafe lifeboats and swimmers, fulfilling General Kenny's cold directive. No reinforcements must reach New Guinea. By 10:15 a.m., the Bismarck Sea had become a scrapyard. Of 8 transports, all were sinking or already gone. 4 destroyers had been annihilated. Burning fuel drifted in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like the blueprint of a civilization being erased. From above, the sea resembled a failed diagram. Out of 6,900 soldiers aboard the convoy, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach Lae. Most perished without firing a shot, casualties of industrial evolution. Japanese survivors later wrote that it felt as if the ocean itself had turned mechanical. The air was full of metal, the sea full of wreckage, and even the sound of the guns carried a rhythm, the tempo of production. That rhythm was America's real weapon. Behind each B-25 was not just a pilot, but a network assembly lines in California, workshops in Queensland, fuel lines, logistics chains, and a command structure that valued modification over perfection. Where Japan worshipped tradition, America worshipped iteration. And iteration, multiplied across an entire civilization, becomes inevitability. The B-25 Strafer was not merely a plane. It was the industrial logic of the modern world airborne. When Admiral Kimura finally ordered retreat, it was already too late. His destroyers were crippled, his radios silent, his doctrine obsolete. The enemy had not only destroyed his fleet, they had dismantled his belief system piece by piece. Using bullets instead of arguments, he had sailed into the future and found that the future spoke a language made of machinery, not myth. When the sky finally went quiet, The sea was no longer blue. It had turned the color of burning oil. Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the deck of his damaged flagship, the wind thick with smoke and the stench of cordite. Around him, the imperial convoy, his perfect geometry, had become a floating graveyard. The air shimmered with heat from burning ships, the water alive with fire and bodies. He had no words for what he saw, because what he was seeing was not defeat, it was irrelevance. In 15 minutes, a system that had taken decades to build had collapsed under a weapon built in weeks. For destroyer Shirayuki, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Asashio gone, all 8 transports burning, sinking, or broken in half. Of nearly 7,000 troops, barely 1,000 would survive. The rest vanished beneath the water, not in combat, but in conversion. Lieutenant Commander Yasumi Doi, aboard the dying Tokitsukaze, tried to rally his men. He shouted orders, tried to redirect fire, but his commands were answered by silence. The gun crews he had trained for years were gone, their stations ripped apart by streams of armor-piercing rounds. He later wrote that it felt as if the air itself was cutting us. For survivors pulled from the wreckage, there was no sense of battle, only shock. The anti-aircraft guns they trusted had melted into twisted forms. The steel shields that were supposed to protect them had been sliced open by 50 caliber fire like soft clay. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the Shigure, wrote in his diary weeks later, "We were not defeated by courage, nor by skill. We were defeated by something we could not imagine, a machine that thought faster than we could pray." The sea became a mirror, reflecting the Empire's illusion back at itself. Ships that once embodied national pride now floated upside down, their names barely visible through the smoke. For the Americans, it had lasted 15 minutes. For the Japanese, it would last forever. As rescue operations began, survivors in the water clung to debris, many still refusing to believe what had happened. Some swore they had seen flying destroyers. Others whispered that the Americans had built new weapons beyond human comprehension. But there was no mystery, only math. Each B-25 Strafer had delivered more firepower in 8 seconds than an entire destroyer could produce in a minute. Each pilot had executed an attack profile calculated to exploit blind spots in Japanese anti-aircraft formations, and each innovation, skip bombing, forward-firing guns, synchronized runs, had been born not in laboratories, but in workshops where improvisation was policy. When word of the disaster reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, he fell silent. He understood instantly what it meant. Japan had built its empire on mastery of the sea, but the sea no longer mattered if the air above it belonged to a system that could adapt faster than any fleet could react. Yamamoto ordered immediate reviews of convoy tactics. But privately, he told his staff there was no answer. There was no countermeasure for a civilization that could redesign its weapons mid-war. In the months that followed, the psychological shock rippled through the Imperial Navy. Reports from field officers described crews freezing at the sound of approaching aircraft, paralyzed by memory, not by fear. One survivor from the Kyokusei Maru later said, "When we heard engines, we saw light 8 eyes of death. Those eyes, the gun ports of the B-25, had become symbols of industrial inevitability. For Japan, the realization came too late. The war was no longer about courage, precision, or honor. It was about systems that learn. The Bismarck Sea was not a battle. It was a lesson. And that lesson was merciless. When industry becomes intelligent, tradition becomes extinct. Kimura understood that before the end. He never raised his binoculars again that day. He simply watched his ships burn and whispered to his staff officer, "It was not the bombs that killed us. It was the way they were made." The sea kept no distinction between hero and engineer. It consumed both and reflected only the truth, that belief, no matter how disciplined, cannot survive when faced with an opponent who can turn imagination into production. When night fell over the Bismarck Sea, the wreckage still burned tiny islands of flame drifting in the dark. The water hissed, the sky was silent, and somewhere below, the 51st Division lay entombed in steel. The Empire had lost more than a convoy. It had lost its illusion of permanence. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not a contest between navies. It was a collision between two civilizational logics, one born of hierarchy, the other of systems. Japan's power had been built on precision and obedience. Its fleets operated as mechanical extensions of will, each gunner, each ship, a part of the same martial geometry. The system was stable, elegant, and deeply human. Men commanded machines. But in 1943, America inverted that relationship. Machines began to command men. The B-25 Strafer was not an invention. It was an adaptation. It existed because the Americans had the one resource Japan did not, an industrial ecosystem capable of learning in real time. Factories, workshops, and laboratories formed a living network of experimentation, where failures were not punished but studied, where improvisation was institutionalized. What Japan mistook for chaos, the messy creativity of Australian mechanics welding extra guns to aircraft, was actually the purest form of control, a feedback loop between battlefield and factory. War had become an algorithm. Each B-25 represented a formula: innovation, speed for volume, survival. And from that equation emerged a new kind of civilization, one where progress itself was weaponized. In the Japanese view, discipline was strength. In the American system, iteration was strength. Every failure was recycled into improvement. Every weakness became data. This was industrial Darwinism, the natural selection of machines. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell into a ship-killing gunship was only one expression of this philosophy. It was the moment when improvisation became doctrine, when war stopped being about valor and started being about throughput, where the Japanese prized harmony, the Americans prized speed. Where the Japanese sought mastery of form, the Americans sought mastery of process. In the end, process won. The collapse of the Bismarck convoy forced a reckoning far beyond tactics. It revealed that the 20th century would no longer reward those who fought hardest, only those who adapted fastest. From that point onward, war became indistinguishable from industry. Every bomb dropped, every bullet fired, was not merely a weapon, but a statement of capacity, the ability to transform raw material into force at scale. That capacity defined civilization itself. The Allied victory in the Pacific was built not just on courage or technology, but on the union of both, on a belief that engineering and imagination were not opposites, but allies. In the workshops of Brisbane, the line between factory and battlefield vanished. There, among torches, blueprints, and trial and error, the spirit of modern warfare was born not as an ideology, but as an operating system. From that lineage would come the AC-47 Spooky, the AC-130 Spectre, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, each an echo of the B-25 Strafer, each proof that in war, the most dangerous weapon is not the gun, but the mind that modifies it. Japanese historians later wrote that the Bismarck disaster did not merely destroy ships, it destroyed Japan's idea of how the world worked. They called it the mechanization of surprise. It was not courage that failed, but comprehension. The empire had prepared for war, as it had always understood it, fought by men, directed by tradition, contained by doctrine. But its opponent fought with something else: fluid intelligence, institutionalized innovation, and the humility to rebuild daily. In the ashes of the Bismarck Sea lay the blueprint of the future, a world where civilization would no longer be judged by its heroes, but by its systems of adaptation. As one American engineer wrote after the war, "We didn't just outfight them, we outbuilt them." And that, in the industrial age, is the same thing. The Bismarck Sea marked more than the fall of a fleet. It marked the rise of a new truth, one that would define the remainder of the century. War was no longer about courage, but about civilization's capacity to organize. Night fell over the Bismarck Sea, and the ocean still burned. Fires drifted slowly on the waves, fragments of ships, oil slicks ignited by the day's fury, glowing like dying embers across a steel horizon. Every few minutes, one flame disappeared as the sea reclaimed another wreck. From above, it looked almost peaceful. The geometry of destruction had settled into silence. By dawn, the smoke had thinned. The waves rolled clean again, indifferent to what they had consumed. Beneath them lay thousands of men, soldiers, sailors, engineers, encased in twisted metal that once defined an empire's order. Their convoy had vanished, but its outline remained a rusted constellation on the ocean floor, perfectly aligned in death as it had once been in life. In the days that followed, American reconnaissance aircraft photographed the scene, the pattern of wrecks, the slicks of oil, the faint outlines of burning cargo ships. The images looked less like a battlefield and more like a blueprint, the record of a civilization meeting the limits of its logic. At airfields across Australia, the mechanics who had built the gunships worked through the night, unaware of the philosophy they had just proven. They cleaned the barrels, refueled the planes, patched bullet holes, and prepared for the next run. For them, victory was not triumph. It was procedure. In hangars and workshops, new B-25 seconds were being fitted with even more guns, 16, sometimes 18, forward-firing weapons. The engineers called them improvements. The pilots called them inevitable. The machine had learned to echo itself. Across the Pacific, Japan began to withdraw its surface fleets. The empire that had once dominated the ocean now feared daylight. Its ships moved only at night, like ghosts avoiding the judgment of the sky. And in that retreat, a realization settled quietly across the Imperial Navy. They had not lost to technology. They had lost to tempo. The Americans had built a civilization where time itself could be manufactured, where thought, labor, and machinery operated on the same clock. And that clock now defined the modern world. Years later, in post-war lectures, Japanese historians would call the Bismarck Sea the death of the artisan empire, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its systems could no longer evolve faster than the machines they created. The ocean still holds their story. Every wreck beneath the surface is a chapter steel frames corroding into silence, their bolts and rivets dissolving like memory. Divers say that, on quiet days, you can still hear something faint when the currents shift, a metallic vibration, rhythmic, mechanical, almost like engines idling somewhere far away. It is the sound of civilization remembering itself. The story of the B-25 Strafer is not about invention. It is about transformation, the moment when industry learned to think, when imagination found its weapon, and when belief was melted down and recast as machinery. The empire that ruled the seas was defeated not by bombs, nor bravery, nor luck, but by a civilization that understood systems. They were not destroyed by enemies. They were dismantled by time.